Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Scarzig and I am here once again to give you my thoughts and opinions about the next batch of Shurima cards that were revealed, J4 and the crew, and then the predict mechanic. We've got the Penitent Squire, a 1-mana 2/2. When I'm summoned, if you behold an elite, create a Tattered Banner in hand, and the Tattered Banner is a 1-mana burst spell. The next time you summon an ally this round, grant it Challenger. This is going to be very strong, of course. Penitent Squire does not have the elite tag itself, but an elite archetype is a deck that always wants to run tons and tons of elites. So this is going to be proccing pretty much 100% of the time with the right deck. And granting Challenger for just 1 mana burst speed is going to be so strong. Cards like Garen that are running elite decks being given Challenger that they get to keep permanently is going to be huge. Garen's level up is actually one of the strongest in the game. It's just that it's very inconsistent with the combat tricks that we've seen lately. Attacking with Garen, especially once you develop him in the mid game into other units with similar stat lines, it's very dangerous for Garen to attack, right? You have to use a really expensive resource in order to make that worth it. But once Garen levels up, he really takes over the game with regeneration and just constantly attacking the opponent. Giving Garen Challenger means that you're going to be able to pick your trades a lot better, like with Braum, for example. A unit that wants to participate in combat in order to fulfill his level up condition, needs to survive damage to get that Poro going on. And Garen is very similar, where in certain board states, it's too dangerous to attack. It makes him line up with your opponent's removal. Your opponent could have a buff. And so by using Challenger to kill a 1/1 or a 2/2 potentially, then it's going to be a lot safer. And that, again, that's just like the major upside of Garen getting hit with Tattered Banner. You could use this on any other unit in your deck that doesn't already have Challenger, and then you're just able to get a really strong value trade with it, and it's going to be great. So Penitent Squire, fantastic card. Next up, we've got Honored Lord. It's a 2-mana 3/2 elite. The first time I challenge an enemy, give me Barrier this round. You'll note that Honored Lord doesn't have Challenger natively, right? It needs to be given Challenger. You want to use like Tattered Banner on it, or the enemy or the unit that you attack needs to have Vulnerable, right? To use this effect. And personally, I don't really think it's worth it, right? Because Penitent Squire doesn't curve into Honored Lord because you don't have the extra mana. On round 3, you could do it where you have Penitent Squire. You play, instead of on round 1, you play it on round 2. Then on round 3, you have the spell mana, right, for Tattered Banner, Honored Lord. And, you know, hopefully you have the attack token at that particular time. But the issue, in my opinion, with Honored Lord is that you potentially can just run Fleet Feather Tracker into Brightsteel Protector to kind of achieve the same effect, especially in the early mid game. If this does go off, it's going to be great, right? 3 attack Challenger unit that can attack something and survive is very strong. But I think that Honored Lord's ability might be a bit too inconsistent to run instead of, you know, again, like Brightsteel Protector or other cards of that nature. It is an elite, so it remains to be seen if elites just really need more for its archetype, but I could see this very easily cut even in a full elite stack. Next up, we've got Golden Aegis. It's a 4-mana slow speed spell. Give an ally Barrier this round and then Rally. Relentless Pursuit being 3 mana it's very important because it's easier to float 3 spell mana. 4 mana is a lot bigger of a commitment, but we've seen in like Fiora Shen where having 4 mana open is more core to your game plan, and they're very used to operating under that limit. So I could definitely see Golden Aegis being run as a one-of, perhaps even taking the place of Relentless Pursuit in Fiora Shen decks. And there are, of course, other archetypes that really do want this ability. Grant an ally Barrier, especially with like other Challenger units too, makes this very strong. Even with scout units, giving them Barrier and Rallying means that you're getting even more value out of this effect. It's going to be a very close call for decks to choose between running Relentless Pursuit or Golden Aegis. I think a lot of the decks that do want to be rallying like that with Relentless Pursuit are so aggressive where they don't really care about the barrier, but by giving your ally a barrier, it opens up the options that you have for rallying. Typically, you save the Relentless Pursuit until the time is just right, the board is in your favor, and you're setting up like a lethal double attack into the opponent where they're forced to block, and then you can open attack them potentially at the start of next round, things of that nature. And being able to throw a barrier in the mix means that sometimes an attack that you normally wouldn't want to rally sometimes becomes very good, especially again with a challenger unit or something. Also, you know, another small thing is that Golden Aegis is also not nopifiable. Your opponent would need to have deny specifically to remove the answer the Golden Aegis. That could also be a consideration where simply it'll be harder for your opponent to deny this, so to speak. If they're trying to keep up with your tempo, it would be less realistic for them to have 4 mana open. Next up, we've got Gallant Rider, a 4 mana 4/4 elite. First time I challenge an enemy, transform me into Vanguard Cavalry. And Vanguard Cavalry, of course, is the 5/5 with tough elite unit. Basically, you can sort of look at Gallant Rider as the first time I challenge an enemy, grant me +1/+1 and tough, which might not be very good if I'm being perfectly honest. Again, because it doesn't have Challenger natively, it becomes very inconsistent, right? If you just curve out with this, it might be fine, but without a way to consistently give this Challenger, it could be difficult. Grand Plaza was a card that saw tons and tons and tons of play in every archetype that wasn't elites. It was something that I was very upset about, that Grand Plaza was very clearly printed as an elite support card, but because it didn't have, like, it wasn't specifically worded to work only on elites, it just saw play in scouts, with ephemerals, and in pretty much every other archetype that wanted it other than elites, because the bonus stats that it was granting was basically the same as running an elite deck and running Bannermans consistently and blah blah. And even now, after the Grand Plaza nerf, scouts are running Bannerman again, potentially. We've seen a few of those, like the Stony Suppressor Bannerman deck. And maybe this is the deck that brings it back. And if that's the case, then Grand Plaza on 3 and a Gallant Rider on 4 could be very huge for the deck, because it will come into play, get +1 attack, Challenger, and then it attacks and then gets another +1/+1 and tough. So then you have this huge unit that punches through and then stays alive potentially to just keep on fighting the opponent. That would potentially be the God Curve, and it just remains to be seen. With Buried Sun Disk, which already has been revealed in Shurima, there could be potential for a lot more landmark removal to show up in the metagame, and it kind of already is thanks to Veiled Temple. So Grand Plaza is going to be very potentially hard to stick, and missing that curve, as we saw with Grand Plaza. If you don't play it directly on 3, suddenly the rest of your deck falls apart, and it might not be worth it to run the Gallant Rider combo unless you have a lot of other cards that make this happen. Tattered Banner being, of course, one of those cards. Hopefully you can draw them in the right order, essentially. Next up, we've got King Jarvan III, a 7 mana elite with tough. It's a 3/6. The stats are very bad. When I'm summoned, draw Jarvan IV. So this is Jarvan IV's J4, his boat, right? You play this and you draw Jarvan to your hand. If he's already in play, instead give allies Challenger and Scout this round. So if you've got Jarvan already, it's very strong. The stats itself on this unit are very bad. Because they're adding so many new elites to the pool, it makes Swiftwing Lancer a little bit worse, right? Because if you aren't running Jarvan and then you get King Jarvan III off of Swiftwing Lancer, then it's just going to be a pretty useless 7-drop. But you know, the attack turns around round 6, around 7, round 8 are going to be pretty huge. You've already probably attacked on, if you're attacking on evens, that is, you've maybe attacked on round 6, so you've got your Jarvan in play. Then on round 7, right, you don't really want to play King Jarvan III, because this attack is specifically designed for you to have the attack token. So you need to wait. And potentially on round 8, if you play King Jarvan III, you get this great payoff with Jarvan, and then this other big guy in play, and then you get Challenger and Scout, which allows you to just completely destroy your opponent's board and maybe swing for lethal, but it opens you up to a lot of other bad things like Ruination or just stuns in general, like Gravitum would just completely punish you for playing King Jarvan III. We've seen it time and time again. If your board looks like it's going to be a really sweet rally turn or a scout turn, if your opponent's able to just develop good enough board against that or deny one or two of the units, especially with something like maybe Crescent Strike or Falling Comet, to just remove one of the units that you were planning on participating in that attack, suddenly it's no longer good for you and you've sort of wasted your big finisher with King Jarvan III. It's going to be really flashy when it goes off, but I'm just worried that around round 6, round 7, round 8, there might be a little bit too much going on to disrupt an attack like that. Because mind you, these units just have Scout, Challenger, Barrier with Jarvan IV, but no Overwhelm, no Fearsome that would really allow you to hit the Nexus. So you have to have your opponent on the ropes essentially. And it might work out. It might work out. It does remain to be seen. But right now, I'm just kind of not buying it. I suppose we should talk about Jarvan IV. 6 mana, elite with Barrier. When you attack, pay my cost to summon me challenging the strongest enemy. This is going to be very difficult, I think, to play around because you don't get to choose if you want to summon Jarvan IV or not. An effect like this, you probably almost always would want to summon Jarvan IV because he comes into play, he's challenging the strongest enemy, dealing 5 damage to it potentially with Barrier, right? So if Jarvan comes into play and connects, then it is very powerful tempo for you, or potentially even if your opponent has a way to pop his Barrier and then Jarvan IV just dives in and feeds, it's a very League of Legends mechanic, then so be it. As long as he moves a unit out of the way and the rest of your stuff gets better trades in exchange, or maybe even gets to hit the Nexus, then I guess it's fine. But the other thing you have to consider as well is that if you don't have any spell mana banked, you attack with Jarvan IV and you're completely tapped out. It would be, I guess, the same as spending your entire turn developing a Cytherea or Genevieve because you want to attack. So Jarvan IV is going to be very similar, but again, sometimes you want to open attack because you have other combat tricks and spells you would rather use instead because you're trying to bait your opponent to block. So it's going to be a double-edged sword for sure, and I don't know if Jarvan is going to be enough to offset the loss of mana from when he comes into play. In the late game, it won't matter as much, right? If you're on like 8 or 10 mana and you've already got spell mana floated, Jarvan coming into play is just another attacker, and that's perfectly fine. He will level up potentially while he's still in the deck. He's probably going to be coming into play with this extra stat line of being a 6/4, so he's potentially going to be a little bit more survivable. And then once he survives at the start of the next round, you get Cataclysm, where for 3 mana slow speed, an ally starts a free attack challenging an enemy. So this is very strong with scouts. The free attack with a scout unit will give you the attack token once again. It'll just be like scouting, but with challenger. So this again with Gallant Rider or Honored Lord. There is some combo potential there, but this is a sort of card I think you really just want to get from Jarvan, and you don't necessarily want to run in your deck. Scout list, as I talked about before, if you have the choice between Relentless Pursuit or Golden Aegis or Cataclysm, I think that because of the specific way that Scout works, Cataclysm is going to perhaps be a little bit better. So the next batch of reveals we have from Shurima are the Chronomancy style cards. There's the new keyword Predict, where when you predict, you look at 3 cards from your deck, you choose one of them to put on the top of your deck, and then the other 2 choices are shuffled into your deck. So it's going to be sort of like Invoke, except the cards you're offered are from your own deck, and being able to manipulate what the next card you draw could be very powerful. The closest we've got, of course, to this particular mechanic is like Draven's Biggest Fan, putting Draven on top of the deck, and because that is communicated to your opponent, it gives them a lot of information about how to play the next few turns, how they want to save their removal. They can predict, you know, what is in your hand, or if you have access to Whirling Death or not, things like that. But with Predict just being a card from your deck, it's purely for your own benefit. It gives you a little bit more adaptation to the current state of the game. You could probably think of it as very similar to maybe, I want to say Salvage, in that it's card draw, but you are throwing, like, you're throwing away cards, right? Potentially, because when you predict, you get to put a card on top of your deck for next round. You don't draw it immediately, but because you're shuffling your deck, if you had other predictions going, right, then you're going to be messing up your own predictions. So there could be there could potentially come a time where you are running a lot of these predict effects, and you really don't want to stack them all in one turn because you're trying to specifically get one card. If you're fishing for something really hard, it could be cool to predict over and over and over again until you end up with the specific card you're looking for on top of your deck. But this is just going to make Shurima more consistent, right? It's going to be a big meme, right? Predict just means that Shurima always has that crazy card that's going to blow you out. We could see there was some memes floating around of people using Predict in order to rig allegiance effects. If we scroll all the way back down to Golden Ambassador, there is potentially a world where if Golden Ambassador and Predict is a good enough like batch of cards, you potentially could splash even more of your deck into another region and simply use Predict to set up a Shuriman card on top of your deck before you play your allegiance. And it's kind of a funny idea, but you're tacking like extra mana on top of your allegiance effects in order to do it. Like Ancient Preparations is a 1-mana landmark that predicts when you play it. So you'd predict. So it'd be a 5-mana Golden Ambassador, and typically Allegiance cards, you just want to play them on curve, and like trying to save combo pieces and stuff like that is probably going to be a bit too, a bit too unrealistic, but it is definitely fun to think about. Ancient Preparations, I think, is a great 1-mana landmark. You play it, you get to manipulate what your next card draw is going to be for round 2. So in an aggressive matchup, you can get that 2-drop that you're looking for, or in a slower matchup, you'll be able to say, no, I don't want to draw my early game. I want to get this specific removal card or my ramp card or whatever happens to be in Shurima for next round. And then after a couple rounds, you just get a 1-mana 2/2, which I think is great. So Ancient Preparations, I think, might be fine as just a generic sort of play for slower decks anyway. It's a delayed 2/2, which is bad. Typically, these early bodies in these slower matchups, but if Sundisk is scraping the bottom of the barrel for Shurima cards to run, you have the choice of Ancient Preparations and Bloodthirsty Marauder. I think that they'll both offset each other very well. Aspiring Chronomancer as a 2-mana 2/3 to predict after you play it might be like the best of both worlds, where you still get the early game prediction, but something with maybe a better stat line just for the sake of missing out on round 1. If you're playing a Sundisk deck, Sundisk is going to be your turn 1 play 90% of the time, 99, 100% of the time regardless, because that's the reason you built your deck. So potentially Aspiring Chronomancer is going to be the card that you run in Sundisk, where you play Sundisk on 1, Chronomancer on 2, and then try to use that to adapt to the matchup. Moving forward, we've got Xenotype Researchers, 3-mana 3/3. When I'm summoned, grant 3 random allies in your deck +3/+3. This card is ludicrous. This is This card is bonkers. There is going to be very ridiculous, like very, very high spell heavy decks, I think, that will run Xenotype Researchers so that the +3/+3 will go onto very specific cards that make best use of these stats. The same way that we saw Starlit Seer decks being run with very minion light decks that are just mostly spells. So that way the buffs from Starlit Seer are stacking on very specific units. I think that Xenotype Researchers would be used in decks of that nature because there's no condition to be met to get this effect. You just have to summon the Xenotype Researchers. You're basically running like Giga Avaros and Outriders with this card. You lose out on the +3/+3 and Overwhelm. Typically you want an offensive keyword to make use of these stats, but you just run Xenotype Researchers in a deck that has those offensive keywords already in it, right? Something like Fearsome, something like Overwhelm, something like Elusive, and you're good to go. This can also just hit itself, other copies of itself, so then you're playing a 3-mana 6/6 that then buffs subsequent cards. Shurima is going to be nasty just with this alone, and other decks, or maybe even other Allegiance decks, running Xenotype Researchers as part of its splash is going to be also pretty nutty. Ionia has like this hand buff thing that they've been trying to do, and I'm wondering if there's going to be some sort of like Kinko Wayfinder, Xenotype Researchers type deck where this becomes your splash and Kinko Wayfinders. So you just get that +3/+3 on an elusive unit, and potentially Kinko Wayfinder summons like a 5/4 with elusive to just punch your opponent, or two of them. And that's going to be the dream. This card is probably going to get nerfed, where it only grant 2 random allies. To be fair, it's throughout your entire deck, so when they arrive is going to be pretty inconsistent. But if we're seeing with like predict, where you Xenotype and then you can predict to put one of the buffed units on top of your deck, then it's going to be a little bit more consistent. And what normally might be balanced by the unpredictability of getting the buffed units in your hand and not knowing which units are going to get buffed becomes a lot more consistent and potentially really broken when you add predict into the mix. But I think that generically people are just going to run this card even if you aren't running predict as well. Next, we've got a 3-mana 3/3 Kahiri the Student. When I'm summoned, grant me +1/+1 if you've predicted this game. So it would just be a 3-mana 4/4. We saw from Loyal Badger Bear that a 3-mana 4/4 is pretty ridiculous even without a keyword. It's very strong because that level of stats in the mid game means that you get to punch through your opponent's early curve, and then you have a 4/2 or a 4/1 still in play that your opponent needs to deal with, where they can't attack into you because you have such a powerful unit. The big issue, of course, with Kahiri the Student is that you have to open up with Ancient Preparations or Aspiring Chronomancer in order to hit that very specific curve. If they add other predict cards, like if there's another 1-drop or 2-drop that predicts that you can run for your early game to make that more consistent, then I think Kahiri the Student will be fine. But if this is the only predict cards for the early part of the curve, getting that 3-mana 4/4 I think won't happen often enough to make it worth it. And not to mention Kiri the Student, if you need to choose a 3-drop, you're going to be running Xenotype Researchers like 100% of the time. Like when we scroll back down, we talked about these last time, Devoted Council and Esteemed Hierophant. Like even in a Sundisk deck, if you don't have to run Esteemed Hierophant because you have enough Shuriman cards to fill your deck, then you've got, here it is. Here's the all-star 3-drop that Shurima's been looking for, that every deck in the game has been looking for. Next up is Kahiri the Returned, a 6-mana 4/4 with Fearsome. When I'm summoned, create a copy of me in your deck. When you see me in a prediction, grant all allied copies of me everywhere +2/+2. And so you can run just one of these and then it'll just put another copy of itself into your deck. But the more copies of it you do run in your initial deck build, the higher chance you'll be seeing it in a prediction. And as long as you can see it in a prediction once, then it comes into play as a 6-mana 6/6 with Fearsome, which is decent, right? The big problem with Fearsome is that it stops being relevant around like 4 or 5 mana. So a lot of the big Fearsome units that we've seen over the course of time have not really been great on their own, unless they have some other really busted thing attached to them, like Terror of the Tides, granting an AoE Fearsome and then debuffing the enemy board. Kahiri the Returned potentially isn't able to do much unless you're running like Bloodmane. Shurima has shown a lot of cards like Quicksand and Exhaust, for example, that can debuff enemies. So there is potential for Kahiri to have a little bit more of a chance to be able to connect once the time is right, but it's still maybe a bit too inconsistent, because if you draw Kahiri the Returned early, then it's not in your deck anymore, and it's going to stop showing up in your predictions. So if you do want to run like a really hilarious Kahiri card, then Kahiri deck, I mean, to get this repeated value where you're just consistently shuffling it in, and then suddenly in the late game you're playing 6 mana 8/8, 6 mana 10/10, 6 mana 12/12 with Fearsome. It's good fun, but it's just, you know, it's a bit of a Timmy card. It's not going to be very likely, in my opinion, especially as you get later and later and later into the game. Fearsome stops mattering less and less and less, even with granting an enemy -4. If you're playing this on round 10, your opponent's going to be playing like an 8-drop that, even with -4 attack potentially, is still going to be able to block Fearsome. And not to mention, if Shurima is very popular, then you just hit Kahiri with Quicksand to take away its Fearsome, and then you get to block it anyway, or just Hush, of course. Just because Shurima is coming out doesn't mean other cards and removal spells, whatnot, are going to be leaving the metagame. I guess the dream with Kahiri isn't that he's going to one-shot your opponent, but it's just the inevitability over time, right? Because every time you summon it, you put another copy of him in the deck. So in a control Shurima deck, maybe you just grind your opponent down until they die to the Kahiris. If this was like, maybe if he was a little bit cheaper, right? If Kahiri was 5 mana, so you potentially summon 2 of them in one turn, once you get to the late stages of the game, I think that it could be very, very strong. But as a 6-drop, it limits you to 1. So he's going to be very singular in being able to threaten your opponent in the late game where he wants to shine. I do appreciate this concept of Kahiri going into some sort of time portal and then going on a crazy time adventure and then showing up with, you know, after he's gotten badassitude. It's the classic anime time skip trope. Moving on to the last couple cards from the reveal, we've got the Preservarium. It's a 2-mana landmark. When I'm summoned, draw 1, countdown 2, draw 1. This is good. This is good. In any matchup that's not super aggressive, you can get away with playing 2 mana, draw 1, because it draws you another card in a couple rounds. So if it's 2 mana, draw 2, but the draws are a little bit spaced out, that's perfectly acceptable. It's a pretty free way to thin your deck ahead of time, and it's a pretty cheap investment for 2 mana. Even with landmark removal being all over the place potentially, your opponent's not really going to want to remove this because you've already gotten value out of it by drawing a card, and a lot of landmark removal is inefficient compared to Preservarium, of course. So it just comes down to how aggressive is the metagame going to be, where you can get away with playing a 2 mana thing that doesn't block for you. And when the new expansion comes out, the meta is going to be very aggressive. That's just how card games are. And also, in a newer set, new aggressive decks get a lot of extra mileage from the fact that even if those aggressive decks aren't themselves optimized, they still have a more straightforward plan than other decks regardless. So Preservarium is going to seem pretty bad, I imagine, when the set first drops. But as time goes on and the meta slows down and stabilizes a little bit, this card's going to be fantastic. Next up, we've got Promising Future, 4 mana slow speed spell. Grants an allied landmark. My countdown completion effect activates twice. I think that this is way too expensive. I talked about how great Preservarium is, but putting another 4 mana investment on top of this so that you draw 2 more cards is going to be, I think, a bit too much of an overcommitment. If they print another, like, really strong countdown effect that summons a big unit when the countdown is done, then Promising Future would be a better fit for something like that. Again, especially if the matchup is one where your opponent doesn't have landmark removal, you know for certain that, like, the deck they're running can't realistically have landmark removal, then you can get away with a Promising Future. It might work, but typically playing a landmark is already a tempo loss in some way, shape, or form. So having another 4 mana do nothing on top of that landmark is only going to be viable in the slowest of slow, like, control v control meta games. So Promising Future is going to be the type of card that won't see play until, like, probably the end of the Shurima cycle. I think it's, like, usually towards the very end of an expansion is when we see, like, the really insane value decks that pass until turn 4, turn 5, where Promising Future could see play. So that is it for the second batch of reveals. The Shurima spoilers are just coming, they just keep coming strong. And if you would like to discuss these spoilers with me live, you can tune in and watch me on Twitch every Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Link in the description below. Please don't forget to like and comment, subscribe for this YouTube video, and we can look forward to the Shurima expansion together. I'll see you next time.